Fire Science Network welcomes you to the second webinar in a four-part discussion series on fuel management practices for mixed dry conifer forests in the Northwestern United States. I am Mary McFadden, the coordinator for the Fire Science Network, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. Next. This four-part webinar discussion series is based on this U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station Guide on Fuel Management Practices. The guide was developed by Terrie, Jain et al. In 2012. The webinars for this series cover four of the topics included in this document. Dry forest ecology, which the webinar is over, but we do have that recording available. Today's webinar, of course, is on prescribed fire, and then the upcoming webinars are wildlife and economics. You can find out more information about the webinars, including viewing past recordings, at nrfirescience.org. If you'd like notification of the upcoming webinars as well as other Fire Science Network events, please join our mailing list, and that mailing list form can be found on our website. Next. Today's discussion on prescribed fire, unique situations concerning fuel treatments within mixed dry conifer forests will be led by three authors of that publication. All three are research foresters with the Rocky Mountain Research Station. Terrie, Jain, and Russ Graham are based in Moscow, Idaho, and Mike Battaglia is in Fort Collins, Colorado. Also joining us today are three guest fire practitioners that Terrie, Jain will introduce shortly. So the webinar format consists of four topic sessions, and at the end of each of these sections, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions to the presenters and the practitioners. To ask questions, you can either ask a question by phone. To do that, you have to have your audio PIN number engaged, and that audio PIN number is located in the audio pane on the right side of your screen. Probably most of you have done that as you logged into the webinar, but if not, you need to enter that PIN. And then go to the attendee list and right-click on your name and raise that hand icon. Therefore, I know you want to ask a question by phone, and I can unmute you. And of course, you can send questions to the presenters via the questions pod, and I'll field those questions and read them to the presenters. I think that's it for the housekeeping. So Terrie, you're ready to begin.
Good morning, everyone. As Mary suggested, this is a series based on this particular document, RMRS GTR 292, and it is accessible in a variety of ways, both a hard copy, through CDs, and online. And a neat thing about it, it has an interactive literature list where you can click on a particular paper that you think you might like to read, and it goes right to that PDF. And all of that can be accessed through the Rocky Mountain Research Station, either through Tree Search. And so please, if you haven't gotten the document and you would like to get it, these are the ways to get that. So as Mary said, the description of the seminar is really going to have these segments and then provide an opportunity for you to discuss this. And so I created this little faces talking to each other to indicate to you this is about the point in time where you guys can open up and ask questions, or where Mary is going to come in with some of those questions, just to give you a kind of a signal as to what's going on. Now the segments will include a little bit of the ecology in relevance to prescribed burning, the planning section, what's important when you're thinking about planning prescribed fire, implementation, which will be both myself and Mike Battaglia, and then I'm going to finish up with some of the monitoring. But also we are privileged enough to have three guests who are fire managers within the dry mixed conifer forest, and they're Darren Reynolds, Tobin Kelly, and Tyre Hulfeldt. And for right now, I'd like to have them each introduce themselves. Darren?
Good morning. I'm Darren Reynolds, Laramie Ranger District AFMO on the Medicine Bow Route National Forest. I've been with the Forest Service on and off since 1995. I'm currently an RXB2 and an RXB1 trainee. Had the pleasure to burn in most of the regions in the United States, and been a field coordinator with the Prescribed Fire Training Center in Tallahassee, Florida for 3 years. It's a great place to get some training, and they do a lot of burning down there, so it was quite an honor to do that.
Tobin.
Oh, good morning. I'm Tobin Kelly. I'm currently the Fire and Timber Staff Officer in the Bridger-Teton Forest in Jackson, Wyoming. I have about 27 years of prescribed fire experience, mostly in western Montana and Wyoming and Idaho, and have participated in various types of timber management and fire activities in all those areas.
And Tyre.
Good morning, everyone. This is Tyre Hofeltz. I'm with the Utah Department of Natural Resources, Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. I manage the fuels and prescribed fire program for the state of Utah, and have been in wildfire since 1995.
Great. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the ecology, and I'd like to introduce Russ Graham. Russ?
Good morning. I'm a research forester in Moscow, Idaho. Been doing this kind of stuff for about, longer than I want to admit, but about 38 years. Been with the Forest Service now, calendar years, for 48 years, which is, a lifetime in some people's minds. But what I would like to do very quickly is go back to some of the elements that we had last week and talk about the ecology and how we define these dry mixed conifer forests. Next. And one of the interesting things that we've strived to do in our synthesis product is make sure it's an integrative product. And as you see on the slide here, we've got silviculture and wildland fire in the middle of all these topics. And both the wildland fire people and the fuel managers, the FMOs, are have to be very integrative and integrate a lot of these subjects. Next, please. And one of the things that we have in this dry mixed conifer forest is they cover a lot of the western United States, northwestern United States, and all of them are inherently unique. And also that makes their fuels inherently unique. So again, this is back to silviculture and FMOs working together to write a prescription that's going to be unique to a specific setting. And all of these depend on fire regimes, other disturbance, succession, and the species. Next, please. And when you look at our synthesis product, this is the area that it covers. It's extensive all the way from northern California into the beautiful Black Hills and down to the Dixie in southern Utah, all of Idaho, and a great amount of all of Montana. So again, these are all inherently unique. And so what we used to describe these was the land fire models. Next, please. And these land fire models is not saying that you need to use these in your planning, your execution, but as you're in your interdisciplinary teams or you're communicating with your publics, this and part of our product provides you just a plethora, a treasure trove of information on vegetation. How vegetation would respond to fuel treatments, how that would respond to burning, what species you might encounter. And this is not only tree species, but shrub and other species also. Next, please. And it gives you these land fire models will give you good examples of what are the early cereal species, what are their shade tolerance, the lower vegetation, whether they're survivors or colonizers. So again, this gives you information on the fire effects that you would get from a prescribed fire and hopefully maybe tailor some of your prescriptions, but more importantly, give you a common knowledge base of interacting with all of those disciplines that I had on the previous slide. Next, please. And again, we're covering all the way from Northern California to the Black Hills, and is very much a diverse vegetation. But all of the concepts we had the potential for ponderosa pine. There's age, size, single story, multiple stories, just a variety of species compositions and sizes that can be created and maintained. So this becomes important both for the silviculture prescription and the burning prescription as to what kind of fuels and what kind of vegetation that we're dealing with. Next slide, please. And one of the most important things that I think we deal with fire and vegetation manipulation in the West is these exotic plants that move in. And the one that I know that we deal with in Utah, for example, in a lot of the drier country, is cheatgrass, for example, really messes up the successional pathways. And this data is from the Interior Columbia Basin Assessment, and there was 90 counties in the Interior Columbia Basin Assessment, and even the deepest, darkest wilderness area county in the middle of Idaho had Canadian thistle and cheatgrass and knapweed in them. So these exotic species cover a lot of our country. Next, please. And dry forest change. Probably the mixed dry conifer forests have changed more than any others. The upper right-hand picture is a ponderosa pine forest in Utah. The lower left-hand picture is a ponderosa pine forest in the middle of Idaho. And the lower right one is another picture of a mixed conifer forest in southern Idaho. And as you can see that these forest changes through fire exclusion and succession, you might have a dry mixed conifer forest, but it's definitely not anything that looked like historical, and may have a whole set of fuel problems and issues far different than you might encounter. Next slide, please. And one of the things that the trees in this forest change gets all of the press, but when you look at when Custer came through the Black Hills in 1874, he was a very vain person, and he made sure he brought a photographer with him. And then when you look at the picture on the left, you'll notice there's very few trees. The picture on the right in 2000 was just stocked with trees. But look at that organic matter accumulation, the ectomycorrhiza and the nutrients moving up to the soil surface. So when we look at planning, and we're going to talk about later in the seminar, of burning around and saving big old trees, the forest floor becomes as important of a fuel and recognizing that forest floor as anything else. Next, please. And this forest change then has altered a lot of our disease mechanisms and our expected fires, wildfires. Once we might have had a mixed fire regime, now we have crown fire regimes. The weather has changed, the insects. So again, the forests are far changed from what we would expect in a native forest, and also the fuels have changed, and the outcomes to plan to modify fuels for an expected outcome will probably interact with the diseases and weather and insects more than anything else. Next slide, please. And the topography is extremely diverse across all of this area. And I'll use the example in Montana, Douglas fir ninebark predominantly occurs on north-facing slopes. You move over into Idaho, you have that same shrub complex, but it occurs on southern slopes. And again, the topography can really dictate all of these fuels and how they will interact and how they respond. So in any given planting unit, you might have an abundant amount of shrubs and trees and diversity of topography that is going to compound the burning and also the response to that burning. Next, please. So again, I guess in summary, the fire behavior and burn severity, both of a wildfire and a prescribed fire, is going to depend on all these other subjects that I just mentioned. And so that when we are dealing with writing a prescription or writing a mechanical treatment before a burning prescription, all of these become important factors. So hopefully I just gave you a quick introduction of the dry mixed conifer forest and probably gave you a indication of how challenging it is to introduce fire and burn in those systems. Next, please.
To provide relevance to what Russ was just talking about, I thought it'd be nice to have some real kind of on the ground, boots to the ground kind of knowledge and skills. And so what we're going to do is after each of these segments, we're going to have a view from the field. And it's going to be in the order of Darren, Toby, and Tyre. So we don't have to continue introducing them in that order. They will be consistently in that order. So I'd like to start with Darren.
Yeah, this is Darren. So what are the critical fuels? Well, the critical fuels, at least in my mind, they're the fuels most relevant to achieving your objectives, whatever the project objectives might be, and that's both inside your units as well as adjacent to your units, and maybe more importantly, adjacent to your burn units. And so we really need to have objectives that are spelled out. They're based on the SMART principle. They need to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time specific. So, for instance, if we had a project based solely on fuels objectives, then the critical fuels are obviously whatever the fuels that would aid in the resistance to fire spread or fire suppression is what we would key on. Another example, if it's an ecosystem-based project, then the critical fuels would be whatever fuels that are degrading or putting the ecosystem in harm's way. High fuel loading, or like Russ alluded to earlier, deep duff depths, that type of thing. How do we deal with them? They're always objective driven. So soils are an issue. The way to maybe circumvent some of that or mitigate it would have low severity, multiple entry burns may be appropriate. And then, working in windows where adjacent fuel models aren't available, the advantage of doing that is the adjacent fuel model would actually be the control agent. That would be your natural fuel break. The advantage is, we'd have least or a lower amount of implementation costs for sure. We wouldn't have to be putting in line or as much line, control line, and then control line can be a vector for weeds and illegal ATV use and a whole plethora of other things. Another thing that you can do to mitigate some of the critical fuels issues, especially adjacent to your stands, is we do a lot of high intensity grazing, and that just isolates that stand just a little bit more. Also tracking those fuels adjacent to and within your stand, and Utah has done a great job. The Great Basin in general, of they've got it's a national live fuel moisture database, but it seems that the Great Basin has taken the lead, and they've got by far the most data within that database. But it's a national database. Anybody can go in and populate it and query it. And then you can look at that database and kind of get an idea as far as planning when your fuels will be available within your stands, and then when the fuels are not available, maybe adjacent to your stands if you want to use live fuel moistures as a control.
Thanks, Darren. One of the things in the book, in our publication, is we have an appendix with all the tools, and as far as I could find in along my searches, and this particular database has a link to it in the tools area in the synthesis. Okay, we're going to continue our discussion with Tobin.
Okay, yeah, as Darren mentioned, some of the critical fuels lie both inside and outside the unit. And in addition, one of the things to look at is how those critical fuels might change over time or with elevation. If you're dealing with a larger prescribed burn unit that has a fair amount of elevation change, and especially as you maybe go through where the snow line laid over in the winter, you can start burning at the top of a unit, and as you move down through that elevation, you might suddenly hit a place where that fuels are quite a bit drier simply due to that's where the snow line is, and so you can get a real change in fire behavior there. So that's one of the critical fuel changes that you can run into in the spring, and can definitely cause some issues if you're not haven't been testing your fuel moistures and aren't ready for it. Same thing with aspect changes there and how that can affect fuels. You know, a few degrees aspect change can really change your fuel moistures. So that's part of, you know, how to deal with some of those is, you know, being very careful where you take and how often you take your fuel moistures with that. Darren also touched on dealing with outside the unit, and that's something here on the Bridger Teton that we commonly do when we're trying to do some aspen regeneration. And we've gone in and slashed the conifers in these aspen stands, and we really want to burn those when the sagebrush and grass, the fuel moistures are such that it simply won't carry in there. It might get a little bit of radiant carrying outside the unit, but once you get away from that radiant heat load, you know, it's just not going to carry in those finer fuels. So those are some of the maybe more specific things I've dealt with.
Now, Tyre, who works for the state, has a whole different world in which he works with. So, Tyre, why don't you give some of your insights?
Sure, thank you. As we deal with prescribed fire and fuels on private property, the most critical fuels are those directly adjacent to structures or those that will impact a community as a whole in the event of a wildfire. And what do we do with those? It's a matter of give and take more often than it is anything, because you're working with private landowners and they have ownership and they have a reason to care about what's on their land, and so we have to determine with them what they're going to allow us to remove and what needs to be kept, and balancing that out with the prescribed fire aspects of if we're going to do this or if a wildland fire is going to impact this community, how do we modify the behavior enough that we as wildland firefighters can protect the structure, protect the homes, or if we need to conduct firing activities within the community to protect that community. And so irregardless of what the fuel type is or the fuel moisture, it's more about the infrastructure of the community, the homes, the streets, the power lines, the pipeline corridors, whatever impacts that community is the most important aspects above and beyond the fuel aspects, even though the fuel-related aspects will drive the endeavors or the objectives that we have when it comes to fire.
Thank you, Tyre. What we're going to do now is we're going to open this up for some comments and questions. So, Mary, any questions?
No, we don't have any questions yet in the queue, but just wait a couple seconds, or sorry, more than a couple seconds. So, folks, if you want to, again, you can raise your hand, the hand icon next to your name if you want to ask a question by phone, or feel free to type in a message. And Terrie, if we don't get any messages right now, we can just move forward, and then we can revisit those questions perhaps later on in the seminar.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, so no questions, so why don't we just move forward, and then we'll have more time on those other sections as well as the end.
Sounds good. Okay, since we'll continue on and we'll talk a little bit about planning. And one of the things when I was talking to our guests and also when we were interviewing managers is that if we were going to do an interview for 3 hours, 2 hours was set on planning. And so this is a big thing and an important piece in all of the fuel treatments as far as implementing them in the dry mix conifers. Planning is a big deal. And based on our interviews, there were a couple things that continuously came up, and that was define and understand the objectives and goals. Having clear goals and objectives is critical. And then the other thing is that a lot of the fire managers, a lot of the other practitioners said it's really important to have strong leadership. In other words, the ranger or the person who is the decision maker really needs to be confident in their own skin, so to speak, and be able to really guide their people to understand what is the real things that they're trying to accomplish. But in that planning section, you really need to think about both the short-term successes, like as we often think of, values at risk, firefighter safety, those kind of things, and to a certain extent, forest products, because we still have to pay for some of the fuel treatments that we're implementing. But, if you think about it, these treatments are only going to be tested for maybe one day when a potential wildfire is going to blow through those things. So not only do you have to think about that, but more importantly, you have to think about linking that to the long-term benefits. And it's really important to think about the social aspects, like Tyre represented, as being from a private scenario. It's all about the social element. The ecological, Darren talked about soil productivity. Some of these things come into play and how they're going to implement prescribed fire. And probably more importantly, where we in our interviews found out is that wildlife habitat was a critical element. When can we burn? When can we not? Some of those green tree retention areas were for wildlife, but how do we keep them alive if they're all grand fir? Those kind of things. And so some of the challenges is not maybe necessarily the prescribed fire itself, but integrating all these other things into your prescribed fire planning. And you got to realize that these treatments are going to be on the ground for decades to centuries. So not only do you have to think about the short-term planning, but you have to think about long-term planning, field treatment longevity, maintenance, those kind of things. So it's really the challenge of the managers to find that balance, and this is where the strong leadership comes into play. You really do need to have it ecologically sound, but you can't take that outside of that economics and the social. So it's always these trade-offs, risks, benefits. And so for the manager or for the decision maker to make a sound decision, it's up to their disciplinary, interdisciplinary groups and other people to give them the information so they can find the right balance. And so that's kind of the critical thing about planning that really came through in our interviews. And in some of the discussions that we had in the chapter on planning, some of the examples we produced was really about finding that balance. And so with that, I think I'm going to switch it back to our managers so that they can give their insight about the value of planning.
This is Darren again. Not only having objective-driven projects, I think as a fire specialist or fuel specialist or an FMO, they've got to be involved in the planning process early. They've got to be able to communicate those issues to other specialists, because we're getting this kind of disconnect from other specialists and fire. When I first started, a lot of timber folks, they were our suppression people. Now, since 2001, when we went through fire hire in the federal government, that's the militia as it was. It's getting smaller and smaller. So there's getting to be this disconnect between specialists and fire suppression or prescribed burning, and you gotta help those people understand that putting a line on a 50% slope, maybe underslung line third of the way down the slope, and try to burn it and hold it on that line may not be the best option. It might be better to go to the bottom of the drainage and try to hold it there. When you're involved early, it just helps avoid development projects that aren't implementable. And I alluded to line location just a little bit ago. And then how these elements get transferred to the burn plan or the complexity analysis. On the units that I've worked on, typically whoever is on that ID team as a fuel specialist or FMO or AFMO or whatever, they're writing the burn plan, or at least assisting in it. It's a good time to get engine foremen involved in the planning process too. They've definitely got the suppression side of things nailed down. So good people to have on that working on that burn plan.
Tobin, can you give me your thoughts about how you deal with this whole planning scenario?
Sure. Like Darren said, being involved in the project early on is very critical importance. Being able to set some objectives that are achievable and measurable. I've had the experience of running into having some objectives put on burns that there's no way we could measure or even figure out. So that definitely can cause issues with the setting up a burn plan and then trying to decide if you were successful or not. Mentioned unit layout also. That's certainly critically important. It's much more difficult to try and hold a fire mid-slope or things unless you absolutely have to. So being cognizant of where that unit layout is, and also looking at in the larger NEPA planning, what your project area is. Are you going to be constrained to just where that particular unit was laid out, or can you go to the ridge top and the creek bottom for your project? So if you get some rollout or some slop over, then it's still within your project boundaries, so you're still within your objectives and your burn plan. So that's very critical. Looking at those distance to values at risk. I'm sure Tyre will talk about that more, but that certainly has at least from the burns I've worked on, can have a major impact on how much cost you're going to have, and that's kind of the final thing is what the cost is, and that's starting through the whole project and planning is seeing what the final cost is going to be to implement that burn, and keeping your decision maker, line officer in the loop on there. Especially as you're looking at some of the more urban interface burns that cost quite a bit more per acre. Is it really cost effective to do that burning, or is there another alternative out there? So that kind of feeds back to the whole planning process to be able to look at all those different alternatives.
Thank you, Tobin. In the Black Hills, it's really difficult to burn because it's like one giant wildland urban interface. There's so many people intermixed, private property. And so I think some insight from Tyre might help us as far as being able to implement prescribed fire when we're really embedded into the infrastructure. So, okay, Tyre.
Thank you. When we talk about the elements of planning, education is one of the most important things that we can do, and we have to get out in front of prescribed fire type projects long time ahead of what we're planning on doing. For us, that could mean literally years in front of a prescribed fire project, getting into community, getting them comfortable with the idea, educating them to the elements that are going into it. What does the plan include? How are we going to light the thing? How are we going to suppress it if it escapes? And on private lands, there are very clearly delineated boundaries, and you do not ever cross them. And those get implemented through discussions and through events and through the organizational structures that we work with to make sure that there's no extra acres. There are no slop overs. That's not even a possibility when you're working in the wildland urban interface area. And as we incorporate our partners into the process, the Forest Service, the BLM, the Park Service, our intra-agency partners like department or divisions of Fish and Wildlife, soils people, waters people, as we incorporate them into the process, we identify more clearly what can be done and what will never be done. And looking to the future on how we're going to implement these projects as a cooperative effort instead of a standalone effort, because there are so many other political ramifications associated with prescribed fire that the social side of it has to be dealt with more often than not than the ecological side of it when we're talking about wildland urban interface. For example, here in Utah, we have a prescribed fire that's within the Salt Lake Valley area, and we've been sitting on it for over a decade now, waiting for the exact conditions that occur in the burn plan. And we're not willing to vary from that because the social ramifications are so significant that we're not willing to go outside of the parameters predefined for ourselves.
Wow. That's kind of interesting. Sometimes, when we're in other areas, like I mentioned the Black Hills, taking some lessons from the people here who are working within that urban interface consistently, I think sometimes this cross-fertilization is really, really helpful as far as being able to kind of get some ideas and hints. So we come across now another series of an opportunity to ask some questions of our guests or other kind of comments. Any out there, Mary?
No, they're not, Terrie. So
Okay.
we can just go ahead and move forward and catch up at the end too.
Sounds good. Okay, the next section we're going to go into is implementation. Okay, so we've been talking about planning, we've been talking about the system. Now it gets down to the bolts, the nuts and bolts kind of scenario. And we're going to cover, at least initially, these 4 general areas that make, some of these treatments, some of the things that are kind of unique to the dry mix conifer forest. But there's other elements in here that might be applicable to outside the dry mix conifer forest. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through each one of these, and we're going to change the style a little bit in that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the silvicultural aspects, why we do something, why not, those kind of things, and then have a particular speaker look at, one of our guests talk more specifically about those. So it's going to be a little bit of a different style as we go through these. So let's start with mastication. Why masticate? Well, in my mind, as a research silviculturist and doing quite a bit of research on mastication, it really is based on what is going to be that you would need to have remaining out of the site. And also, if there's no other alternative to use. Mastication isn't what you call, I'm going to put in quotes, natural or reflective of historical disturbances or any kind of disturbances. It's really altering the fuel bed and not really removing anything. So I use mastication in my mind when I don't have when I can't burn or I can't lop and scatter or I can't pile and burn, or I have so much biomass that I have to remove that a masticator is the most economically efficient thing. And so consequently, I look at mastication not something that you use everywhere consistently over time, but as a tool to get a place back to something that may be more reflective of what your management goals are, when there is just no other way you can do it without spending a fortune. And so that's when I think mastication becomes a very good tool in that way. But in some cases, particularly in a particular place or anything, burning of masticated material has occurred. And so I'd like some comments from particularly Darren about what his philosophy is and what kind of information he's brought up from mastication, and then I'll follow with some of my own experiences as well. Okay, Darren.
Thanks, Terrie. She brings up a great point. You're really not removing any fuel. We're just changing it in a way that's less susceptible to burn. The orientation, it's more tightly compact on the ground, more kind of like a sawdust fire, if you will, if anybody has experienced that. But it is a great way to prep, especially if you have a significant amount of ladder fuels, or maybe the stocking densities are such that you're not going to be able to thermally thin them. It's a good way to prep that. Do be cognizant things that's kind of bitten me in the past, burning masticated material. The resonance times, since the fuels are so compact, the resonance times are much longer, maybe even 10 times longer than a needle cast fuel bed. Smoke can be a significant issue. These things, masticated fuels, have a tendency to smolder for a long periods of time, which can create some severe smoke issues. You can mitigate some of that by burning when the fuel moistures in that bed are sufficient that just the top layer burns, but then you're going to have to go back and do multiple entries. Be cognizant of that. Also, I know, or at least I've heard that they're working on some models that will more accurately model this fuel bed, but there's not really a current fuel model right now that's real representative of it. So when you're developing burn plans and using Behave, just be aware of that your flame lengths, rates of spread, they may be skewed from whatever fuel model that you're using.
Yeah, you know, Darren is right about altering or mitigating your fuel moistures. And one of the things when we were doing this, kind of checking it in Boise Basin Experimental Forest when I was doing it, we would have like 6-inch flame, flame heights or lengths, but yet the heat was so intense coming up that we actually crown scorched those lower trees at least about 5 to 6 feet. And they were young trees, so they were able to withstand that. But if you notice on the lower right-hand picture, look at the scorch on that tree to the side of me and how high that was. And it really wasn't due to actual flames as much as that intense heat that came along. And so, you know, that's one of the things. And the other thing we did when we burned this is we had really high soil moistures and lower Duff moistures above 100%. And so what happened to us is the heat went up and not down. And as you can see on the picture where I'm standing, we still had a lot of the surface layer, we still had litter layer, but we removed a lot of that masticated material and then raised the canopy base heights. But you got to be really careful with your prescriptions. And recently, Joint Fire Sciences had an announcement on mastication. As Darren said, there's no fuel models. And I know that there were 2 projects that were actually funded to focus on that fuel model as well as the size, piece size, and then to complement that some kind of silvicultural recommendations on how to implement mastication to mitigate some of these issues concerning heat and burning. So there's still ongoing stuff going on. So I think that some of that fuel modeling stuff will occur and be placed into Behave and other fire behavior models. So we're going to switch to shrubs. And one of the things that we have in the synthesis is a table, probably in one of, I think, chapter 4, that talks about the different tolerances, flammabilities, and those kind of things. And, you know, you really start thinking about the use of shrubs as a parameter in your prescribed burning, and that's why we put it in there. And so, you know, Tyre has quite a bit more experience in burning in this area, so I'm going to get some insight from Tyre. Tyre, what is your opinion on all this stuff, or at least your experience?
So as we've utilized the shrub structure as a holding contingency within the prescribed fires that we use, we look for those live fuel moistures to be over 200%, specifically in the sage. You'll have some radiant heat damage directly adjacent to the fires, but we're talking fires that we're doing are in Conifer stand replacing fires, and we're using the sage as the holding element within that. The other shrub types that we work in are oak brush. It in and of itself is a very unique situation where we burn in it because you have a lot of dead standing within the stands themselves, as well as a lot of material that's on the ground. So you have potential for both aerial as well as ground creep when working in those fuel types. And so as we burn those, we find that snow is the best element, irregardless of what the vegetation fuel moisture is, that snow is the best holding element when burning in the shrub fuel type.
Now we're going to switch to pile burning, and you know these pictures are taken in the Black Hills where whole tree harvesting is the preferred alternative, and the piles become absolutely huge. And so Tyre wanted to kind of give some insight about pile burning. So Tyre, why don't you give us some of your experiences with that?
Sure. So pile burning is probably the largest percentage of prescribed fire burning that we do on private lands. It's what landowners are the most comfortable with. When you are looking at pile burning, you have to look at the construction of the piles within the stands, how large they are, how wide they are, so that the residual vegetation isn't scorched or damaged so severely that you end up killing what you wanted to leave for the landowners. As we have done commercial type prescribed fire burning and piles, the piles are so large that you're working in scenarios of control, and therefore you're looking for what is the best element or scenario or situation to work within to limit the liability of the practitioner more than anything. The ecological effects are is that these piles are so large, but they're they're so compacted in the landscape, meaning they're not spread across an entire landscape. They're just in isolated areas that you're going to have soil sterilization for sure in the areas where these large piles occur, but they're so small compared to the overall landscape that we're okay with that. Over the long run, they will rehabilitate themselves.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting challenge. Once again, back to that balance of ecological, economics, and social, and, dealing with soil productivity, those kind of things. So, the piles are the most effective and efficient way to harvest these areas, but there are also some trade-offs that we need to recognize. And so once again, finding that balance. And one of the things I want to point out when Tyler talked about damaging the surrounding trees, if you look at that lower pile on the far back end, do you see those big trees being torched off by that pile? That's kind of an interesting, you can imagine the kind of fire behavior, and I think he's right about the liability and those kind of things when trying to ignite these things. The last one is Lop and Scatter. This is a very common one that we've used historically, and I've invited Tobin to give us some insight about how it is to burn these Lop and Scatter units.
Okay. Yeah, this is a pretty good picture from a Lop and Scatter perspective, because that's a fairly heavy fuel load there. And so that certainly, when you're looking at Lop and Scatter, you can run the gamut, anything from this, where you have a lot of large diameter fuels that obviously are not going to burn in this, and a lot of fine fuels that once they cure out will produce a fairly intense fire, to you get in the more ponderosa pine types, or maybe doing a little bit of thinning from below, and you might have pockets of the thicker fuels where you've taken out some pine or Douglas fir or grand fir to that it's easy to pull them out to prevent scorch from scorching the under or the overstory to fairly light load. So that's one thing that's real interesting with the Lop and Scatter is you can certainly have a wide range of fuel loadings out there. So that's one of the critical things, especially if you do have what your overstory is, how packed those stands are, or if they're going to vent pretty well, being able to pull that away from the boles of the trees, so you're preventing that cambial damage. So those are some of the critical things, and also the recognition for what tons per acre you're going to be leaving out there, and how fast the 10 and 100 hour fuels are going to dry out if you're looking at trying to get rid of those and maybe a two burn scenario. So those are some of the issues with Lop and Scatter. And again, looking at outside the unit, there's certainly more potential in a place like this to have a holdover that you may not be seeing any smoke, but you get a very windy day, it'll pop up. So that's one of the considerations for looking at the heavy fuels in those Lop and Scatter units.
The next area that we're going to talk about is basically a miscellaneous hodgepodge of a variety of things, including Duff moisture, lower Duff moisture. As we see in this left-hand side, there's a certain amount of moisture, and then the lower Duff, and then the Duff reduction. And so sometimes when you're dealing with large trees, or you're dealing with maybe soil productivity, this lower Duff moistures become really important. The other thing is we often have to do is that fuels is not often the only objective. There's other things, wildlife habitat, those kind of things, and snags become a very important critical element. So how do you burn around these snags? When is it a safety issue? Those kind of things. And that takes us all the way back to the planning scenario about how do we begin planning if wildlife, certain elements are really, really critical, how do we put that, recognizing that we're going to have to burn those later on, and how are we going to keep those snags in place from a safety issue, as well as, burning is just kind of has its own risks and trade-offs, and there's not that complete control over it. So, some of this integration of these things are really critical. And Tobin had some insights about how he's dealt with it over time. So, Tobin?
Okay, I'll kind of start off, looking at the Duff, and we have the chart there with the Duff moistures, and so that's certainly going to be a difference when you're moving from your drier sites that have very little Duff there to, your more moisture sites, higher productivity sites have much deeper duff. And so some of the objectives in your burn plan might be an X percentage amount of duff exposure for getting a tree regeneration, things like that. So that's where, being able to monitor your duff moistures is going to be critical for achieving those objectives. And again, that's where you get certain aspect changes. Even a few degrees of aspect change, especially in the spring, can greatly affect those duff moistures. And so that's something critical to know about. And that's also something where you can expect to have, the duff consumption and where you may not get that duff consumption. Looking at the rotten wood pockets, again, in the springtime, given a normal year, you'd expect those rotten wood areas, probably be retaining quite a bit of moisture there, and so they're going to be fairly resistant to burning. If you're burning in the fall after a hot summer, those probably tend to be quite a bit drier. So if fire gets in there, it can be difficult to mop up. And again, if those are laying against some of the older trees, some of the larger trees that you want to try and save from mortality, that's certainly an issue with trying to burn in spring or fall and looking at what the moistures are in those wood pockets. The snags issue, is always interesting, because we're out there creating some snags, they're burning, and we're also taking some snags out that are going to burn up. And so that's one of the critical things, talking with your wildlife biologist, where, what you feel you're going to be able to save for snags, how much you're willing to put into working around those snags, and how safe is it to work around those snags to try and save them. That's one of the probably more difficult things to work with, as far as safety goes and things like that. That is one of the probably critical things, is working with the other specialists, is that, making sure they're aware of it, and take them out and while you're burning, so they can see what some of the difficulties are.
Thank you, Tobin. The next webinar is going to be focused on wildlife habitat elements. And so, kind of turn around and thinking about how we're going to integrate some of these elements and which ones are really critical, which ones aren't. Maybe some of those discussions might be carried out in our next webinar as far as those key wildlife elements. But all of these play into how to implement prescribed fire and the things to think about. And, if I was talking to someone who didn't know anything about prescribed fire, I say the first thing is it depends. The second thing is it's really kind of complex, and it varies depending on conditions, forest type, etc. So with that, we've talked about some specific issues or some specific situations, but I think there's other things that come up when you're doing prescribed burning, and those are kind of some of the lessons that are near misses and the value of patience. So I'm going to return back to our guest, starting with Darren, to talk about these two subjects in a very short description about what he does or how they deal with it in his world, so to speak.
So in my mind, what makes a prescribed fire, the implementation side of it, successful? I think keeping your burn organization the day of the burn as integrated as possible. And what I mean by that is put a torch in your wildlife biologist's hands, or your silviculture's hands, or even a line officer if they're available. And so they can start learning some of the issues that you may be having that particular day, and just what's implementable and what's not. And I think great monitoring when you're implementing the project. If you see some things that isn't quite right, especially one of the objectives, you may only be wanting to remove, say, 50% of the duff, and it's just a little drier than what you expected, burning a little hotter than what you expected. And if you have somebody monitoring that on the day of the burn, you can shut that down, and then hopefully mitigate any issues down the road. As far as near misses and escape situations, I think a lot of times these type of situations. They're driven by projects that they're difficult to implement, or they have tight windows, or it's a fuel type that's just hard to control. One of those would be, true first hands, especially subalpine fir. It's got a lot of ladder fuels. It spots readily, and you just have to be cognizant of that when you're developing your burn plan, and even going back all the way back to the planning stage in those fuel models. I've been bitten a couple times. The project area was just it was too small, burning in true first stands. And most of the time, that's been driven by not having the right people involved in the planning process. They could mitigate that early on in the process, and maybe educate some of the specialists that if there was some issues. And as far as the value of patience, Jim Derwachter, he was the director at the Prescribed Fire Training Center in Tallahassee for a few years. I had the privilege of working underneath him and burning with him, and he always made a great quote that a monkey can turn a piece of ground black, but it takes a real fire practitioner to burn for objectives, and a lot of times to meet those objectives, you got to be patient. You've got to take the time to follow the trends in your fuels. Make sure those objectives are clear and concise, and everybody's on the same page with it. And it really comes down to waiting for the right window to achieve those objectives.
Thank you, Darren. Tobin, do you have some insights about these subjects from the field?
Sure. Like Darren mentioned, again, we've been hitting objectives pretty hard, and so that's, you have clear objectives, and everybody knows where they're at and what they are, and being able to have we talk about patience too. The one question is having the patience when you maybe are on the drier, hotter end of your prescription, and you still want to go out there and implement the burn, but you may have to burn very slowly. One time we took about 3 days to light 85 acres in Ponderosa pine because there was a lot of fairly heavy fuels, a lot of mistletoe trees, and we were very successful, but it was a lot of patience, just very slow lighting and letting things back around and burn. That's especially critical in the helicopter ignition operations, be it a PSD machine or a helitorch. Is that it's quite often the tendency is that people think they're spending a lot of money, get excited around aviation, and you need to put more fire on the ground. Especially critical with a PSD machines, where it definitely takes time for that ignition technique to get going. So that's where patience is pretty critical. Just be able to go sit down or fly around for a while and see how things are going to operate. Then knowing when you can, you're far enough into your unit, things are going well, and you can put much more fire on the ground. So those are some of the things for implementation that are pretty critical. Near misses and escapes. One of the things you got to look at, if you really look at where a lot of escapes are, they tend to be days after ignition, where you need to kind of stay on top of that unit as conditions change, things dry out, fire kind of creeps around, moves around, and being able to stay on top of that, especially when you get in a wind situation. Been around some both wildfires that we had worked on heavily, and also prescribed burns where you hadn't seen smoke for over a week, and you get one of those cold fronts in the fall coming through, and you get 30, 40, 50 mile an hour winds, and those burns wake back up. So those are some of the things, is being able to stay on top of those burns for days afterwards till you're very satisfied that they are out.
Thank you, Tobin. Tyre has a whole different world in which he works with, and probably near misses and escape situations isn't what he's trying to get. So, Tyre, what are your insights concerning these kind of critical elements when it comes to prescribed burning?
when we talk about the success of prescribed fire, one of the most important things is that we're always safe. There's never a scenario where it's okay to be unsafe. There's never a scenario to go so fast or to go so slow that it becomes imperative that somebody's at risk in the process. And so we really have to focus on that, especially when it comes to wildland-urban interface, because of the social ramifications that come with prescribed fire. And the elements that go into successful prescribed fire in the wildland-urban interface are limiting smoke impacts. Above and beyond everything else that we do is limiting the smoke impact that comes from prescribed fire. So we have to have the right winds, we have to have the right lift. We've got to understand the communal structure and the impacts that smoke may have within that communal structure and limit that as best as we can through the lighting techniques or through paying attention to the weather conditions that are out there, and then having all the partners on board. And for us, that's not just our intra-agency partners, but it's the interagency partners as well. It's the Forest Service, it's the BLM, it's the local police officers, the local fire departments, because those are the entities, those local resources are the entities that will take the brunt of the social ramifications that occur because of a prescribed fire. And if they're educated and can talk clearly and concisely about the event, then we will be more successful over time as people begin to understand how fire is used and how we implement it and the safety that goes into implementing those fires. And patience, patience, patience. You can't underestimate the value of patience when it comes to people and the use of fire on private properties, because they're scared of it. It's not something that is utilized as a land management tool on private lands very often anymore. And so the practice is not in vogue, and we have to re-educate people to the value of utilizing that fire. And so that's where patience really comes in to play. Unfortunately, we have had one near miss in Utah. We had a little slop over on a prescribed fire that we did jointly with the Forest Service, and it burned up 10 acres. And then we had a major rain event over the prescribed fire area, and it caused a significant debris flow. The community was all for the prescribed fire. They were excited. They were there watching. You know, they pulled out their lawn chairs and were excited, and the event went off really well until we had the rain event and we had the debris flow, and it moved debris from the fire area to the community, whether it was because of the fire or because of the rain. It's difficult to say, but they associated the fire with the debris flow. And so you spend a lot of time repairing relationships in those scenarios, and it's never okay for us to do that on private lands. Once you've built a trust, you can't damage that trust because it takes so long to repair that trust.
Thank you, Tyre. You know, I think that's a critical element, because sometimes, you know, when we're going in there, we think about the social things, but Tyre has a whole different view about how important that social relationship is. And I think that his hints and ideas could be very helpful. At least it helps me learn more about, you know, when is a good time to use fire and when is it not. So with that, we're going to continue on with this implementation, and then at the end of this section, we'll have another opportunity. We'll have an opportunity for questions. I'm noticing a few questions coming up. So be patient, and then you can ask questions throughout for all the entire thing. So now I'm going to switch it over to Mike Battaglia to talk about thinning with fire. Mike?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Again, Mike Battaglia, research silviculturist here in Fort Collins. And I just wanted to talk to you guys about thinning with fire, because we know that fire was an integral part of the dry mix conifer ecosystems. And we've been using prescribed fire to modify forest structure across a range of forest types and stand development stages. Next. And so there are many different ways that we can use fire to damage our trees in order to induce fire-related mortality. And whether or not we use fire to damage the crown by scorching the needles or consuming needles and killing buds to reduce the photosynthetic capacity of the tree, which will reduce the amount of sugars to keep that tree alive. Or we could target the cambial tissues, which requires high temperatures to penetrate the bark, girdle in the tree, which will reduce the amount of nutrients that are being transported from the needles to the roots. Or we could also target the roots, which we usually measure by looking at how much of ground char there is. That would indicate that heat pulsed into the ground, killing the roots and reducing the water intake of those trees. And understanding how our fire behavior can influence the different damage pathways will allow us to exploit or protect these weaknesses when we develop prescriptions for different tree species. Next. So the level of success of using prescribed fires is dependent on many things, and one being the target tree species we're using and the size of those trees. So for instance, if you had a mixed conifer stand that had ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and white fir, for instance, we know that ponderosa pine and Douglas fir are susceptible to fire when they're in their seedling and sapling stage, but as they mature, their bark becomes thick, and it's more difficult to induce that mortality. Whereas other tree species, such as the true firs, like grand fir, subalpine fir, and white fir, which are not fire adapted, they have shallow roots, low canopy base heights, and thin bark. It's a lot easier to kill them with fire, the same intensity fire that you would have that a ponderosa pine would survive, a white fir would not. So we can use this information to target specific tree species when we're using fire. And the other thing to think about when we're using fire to kill things like the true firs, which have really low canopy base heights, is that fire can get into those that surface fire can get into those canopies very easily, and it's sort of a problem because it could cause spotting. We're going to have a lot of torching, and it's a little more dangerous. Next, please. So, a lot of effort and research has been put into the ability to predict post-fire mortality based on the damage to crowns, cambium, and roots. And that research has been actually implemented into the fire behavior models they use to look at fire effects such as FOFUM and BEHAVE and FFE for the fire and fuels extension. And those mortality predictions are actually based on research, which some of these papers here on this slide have been put into those models. And if you are interested in looking at any of these models to predict mortality on your forest, these are all found in that interactive literature citation list that Terrie had mentioned in the beginning of this talk. Okay, next. So besides tree size and species, another thing to consider when we're using fire is fuel moisture. And that fuel moisture influences fire intensity and behavior because the fuel moisture can act as a heat sink. So it takes, before anything can ignite, any material can ignite, the fire has to drive off the water before that thing will ignite. So it takes a lot of energy to do that. And sometimes we just can't get something to burn because the fuel moistures are too high to allow ignition. Next. So related to that is the availability of fuel to burn. So this picture on the top is before prescribed fire, and the picture on the bottom is after that fire. And so you can see on the top there's a lot of fuel there. There's a lot of fines. There's 100 hours, 10 hours, and 1 hour fuels. And because the fuel moistures were too high, we were only able to reduce the needles in the 1 hour fuels in this, and it was a very low intensity fire, and which is fine if that was our objective. If our objective, however, was to kill some of those ponderosa pine trees, saplings there, we would have needed much higher intensity fire, and the fuel moistures would need to be a lot lower in those larger diameter fuels. And so understanding how fuel moistures are going to influence fire intensity and to meet your objectives is really important. Next, yeah. So some other parameters that we need to consider when we're using prescribed fire as a thinning agent in any situation are things like wind, temperature, humidity. Humanity would be good too. Ignition patterns. So in terms of wind is a really useful tool because it influences your rate of spread, the duration, and your flame heights. And so knowing what kind of wind speeds you have, you can influence whether or not those flames are going to transition into the crown to inflict damage to the crown if that's what you're going for, to kill a tree species. Or also winds can help dissipate the heat. If you have a very calm day and the fire's moving slow, a lot of that heat's going to stay in the forest and scorch your needles a lot more than if you had wind that would dissipate some of that heat. Temperature influences fire behavior and fire intensity because, again, depending on what temperature it is outside and what the fuel particle temperature, it takes energy to heat that fuel up to that ignition temperature. And so the colder it is, the more input in terms of energy it's going to take to catch that piece of wood on fire. And then again, humidity is related to that fuel moisture parameter, especially for those fine fuels. If the humidity is too high, the fire won't carry in those fine fuels, and you're going to have ignitability problems. And then the last thing is ignition patterns. As fire practitioners, there's different ways that you can put fire on the ground to get different intensities. With a back and fire or a strip head fire, you can set the lines on the strip head fire with different widths so that you can manipulate the desired flame length. There's spot firing and center ring firing to when you encircle the perimeter, you can get a lot of intense fire. And then there's other firing techniques as well. Next. And just one thing I really want to impress upon people is it's often hard to go in right away when a fuel treatment, before fuel treatment, and just use fire alone. The amount of fuel that's on the ground is quite high, and the danger of that can be a little bit more than the pucker factor we're willing to do. So we do a lot of mechanical treatments first. And so you see this picture, this ponderosa pine forest that's been treated. But what you can see is there's regeneration starting to come, and we know forests are dynamic and they start to grow. Next, Terrie. And so eventually we need to keep cognizant that fuel treatments don't last forever. And we cut them, they grow, and we get the same situation back. And we need to be cognizant of that. And so next, Terrie. So, one of the things that I think is really important is not only using fire. It's a little bit harder to use fire to thin trees before mechanical treatment. But once we do those mechanical treatments, using prescribed fire as a maintenance treatment to keep densities low, ladder fuel densities low, and meet our objectives through time, I think is a really important thing that we need to keep in mind, and that fire can play a very important role in maintenance of these treatments. Next, Terrie. And so but to be able to effectively use that prescribed fire, we need to keep in mind of a good understanding, and this is a locally based understanding. Seedling and sapling susceptibility to fire, that's probably going to be quite universal across our regions. Size relationships and susceptibility to fire is pretty universal. But what's not universal across the regions, and this goes for any forest type, is understanding how, after you do a treatment, how fast regeneration is going to establish and how fast those growth rates are, or how fast those trees are going to grow, and how fast fuels are going to accumulate and what the associated fire behavior is going to be. So after you do a treatment and tree regeneration occurs, how fast are these trees going to grow to sizes that make them less susceptible? And then how fast are those fuels going to accumulate after treatment? So we know there's enough fuel to actually carry a fire and create the fire behavior to meet our objectives. And so these are sort of local things that managers need to figure out so they can fine-tune their prescriptions in order to meet their objectives. Go ahead, Terrie.
Okay, using fire to do some thinning, Mike has probably done more of it than I know of as far as understanding it more specifically from the science perspective. And so not only do we think about young killing fire with thinning, we have a good habit of killing big trees with fire as well. Killing fire with thinning, killing trees with fire. Dealing with duff around large trees is also a big issue. And one of the things that our synthesis does is it actually also works as a way to get to more information. And Sharon Hood in 2010 published a paper that kind of synthesizes the current up-to-date knowledge on dealing with duff. And we have that as one of our references in our interactive literature list. But I'm going to get down to the brass tacks about how do you decide what, when, and where. Basically, this is kind of this decision tree. If you have duff greater than 5 inches, okay, yes, no. If you don't really have to worry about it. You can just introduce fire, those kind of things, and not worry about the stuff around large trees. But if you have greater than 5 inches, then you need to think of Plan B. And the Plan B is, do you have woody roots in that lower duff, or do you not have woody roots in that lower duff? And it's pretty easy. It's pretty obvious. If you have roots in there, all you got to do is dig it down. As Russ says, get a shovel, pull it out, grab a handful. And if you see a lot of woody roots, probably are so that you have an issue with woody roots. If you don't, then the big thing you need to worry about is the cambium, killing off the cambium. And in that case, all you need to do is remove some of that duff away from the tree prior to burning. And I've heard that it's probably about 12 inches. If I think Sharon verifies that in that publication from 2010. But if you have woody roots in there, then you need to think about both cambium scorch, or killing the cambium, but also there's the potential for increasing the stress to those trees, leading to delayed mortality. In that situation, the best time to do this is when the tree is fairly dormant. And the reason for that is that the fine roots become dormant in the soil. They kind of lose them out. They're not active. And so if you're going to burn or do anything with them, it's when those roots are the least active. And that's when the soil temperatures are anywhere between 35 to 48 degrees Fahrenheit, and the roots aren't active, so you can change that environment, and then when they begin to regrow, they regrow or readjust into that new environment. So that's the timing that's critical. If you're not going to use fire, say like in a smoke impact zone like we had in Libby, Montana, then you could probably do, the temperature is the big critical factor. And for no roots, then you want to be able to remove that right just before burning in those situations. And typically those are drier, so a leaf blower might work better than, say, a rake. And in this situation, the fire managers liked this particular long rake because it was kind of removing a lot of it in one fell swoop. Now, if you're going to use prescribed fire, then you also have to have those lower duff moistures greater than 85%, probably around 90% on average. Some of the ones on the south-facing aspects may be drier, but you really want them to be fairly wet because you don't want to have to, you're still dealing with the cambium kill. So you want to have them high so that the temperature kind of goes away from those roots and it doesn't smolder as long. So those are kind of the hints as far as being able to deal with these large trees. So treatment implementation, we get lots of arguments. Well, it's not worth it. Well, here's some big 3 questions that you can ask yourself. What works? Ecological effectiveness. Can it be done? Ease of implementation. And cost of implementation. Is it worth it? If you have a very socially sensitive area, something like what tire deals with all the time, then it may outweigh the cost of implementing this stuff. Also, if it's in a sensitive area, you might find out that it's about as economically reasonable to do that versus maybe risking killing those trees or even trying to burn those trees, because your parameters would be so narrow that it might be difficult to implement a prescribed fire in the first place. So those are kind of the key things. From monitoring, I think you need to wait 2 years after your treatment. It takes a couple of years for those roots and everything to kind of readjust. And then check 5 years later to make sure that you don't have that delayed mortality. And maybe by that time you can start doing some more maintenance burning, getting it back to what it was before. So, when you do this, it's in those stands that are sensitive, have over 100 years of no fire. Those kind of situations might be where you need to consider these. So we're going to continue on to talk about the monitoring, and then we'll have at least a few minutes left for questions. You know, monitoring was one of the other things that a lot of the managers brought up, but what was interesting is that often isn't implemented for a variety of reasons. One, they run out of money, or there's so many things to do, you just can't do it all. But Chapter 10 in our synthesis kind of goes through three big areas of monitoring. First of all, quantitative monitoring is better than qualitative. And really there's the short term, say meet prescribed fire objectives, the midterm, talking about fuel treatment longevity, something like what Mike was referring to, and then that long term, that enhancing of resilience. Are we achieving that enhancing resilience? And that might be more of a landscape perspective and how the different structures and compositions move over time. But I'd like to get some comments, some final comments from our guests concerning their view about monitoring. And we're going to start with Darren.
Yeah, real quick, it looks like we're running short on time, but you know, do we monitor? Does monitoring occur in all stages? Absolutely. We try to. We don't try. We do monitor preconditions. We monitor on the day of the burn, and we also monitor, as you know, as Terrie alluded to, down the road, 2 to 5 years. Let you know when you're back into that stand, and let you know that the long-term mortality of the treatments that you had. You know, it is tough. Budgets, like Terrie alluded to, you know, the Forest Service in particular is in a static environment. There's a lot of turnover, and getting that monitoring to follow through over time, it can be rather challenging. We use a lot of photo points, and then on the day of the burns, we use the FEMO's a fire effects monitor. It's a NWCG position. You can plug that person into your burn organization, and then they use whatever appropriate forms are to make sure you're achieving your objective.
Thanks, Darren. Tobin?
Yeah, you know, Darren hit on a lot of it. You know, certainly monitoring pre-burn, see what your fuel loads are and all that. During your burn, have your FEMO out there and doing your post-burn. You know, did you actually reduce the fuels you're looking at? One of the important things, especially in the dry ponderosa pine sites I've worked in western Montana, is, you know, weed infestation, and I believe Russ talked about that a little bit earlier. You know, the knapweed and Canadian thistle and things like that, cheatgrass. You know, so you know, if you're out there actually doing burning, you might not be doing good things for getting weed introduction. So monitoring is very important there. You know, photo points are great to have, and actually doing some you know, monitoring on the ground for you know, what vegetative species are out there and what their amounts are. And the time, you know, again, you just have to have the push to get out there and do that. And it's especially works especially well if you have somebody who's been around a long time. We're fortunate here on the Bridger Teton. Our forest fuels tech has been here many years, and he's very interested in monitoring. And we're actually this morning they're going over fire monitoring effects for the last 10 years on a number of burns.
Thank you. Final words, Tyre.
On the monitoring side, it's really difficult for state entities and cooperators that are our equals in the industry to do such, because there's no one position assigned to it. It's generally another duty as assigned. We do attempt to do as much monitoring as we can. I am myself the only monitor for the state of Utah, and I have over 300 project sites and locations to visit to make that monitoring. However, it's important to do. There are vegetative condition classes 1, 2, and 3, and the further away you get from a defined point, the discrepancies in what you want could be far wider than what is existing on the ground. And so you have a condition class, and this is really important in the monitoring side, is that you may have a condition class 3, so the furthest departure that you can have, and you do a project, a prescribed fire, and you're still in condition class 3, but monitoring that project to determine whether or not the efforts that went into the planning and identifying the objectives to get in time to that condition class 1 are important, and if you're not getting there, you can identify that through the monitoring aspects and help modify the objectives or implement different planning strategies as you move forward in additional projects.
Thanks, Tyre. Mary, do we have any questions?
We do. This is related to something Russ suggested earlier. Dale writes, Russ suggested that soil flora and fauna rises in the soil profile with fuel accumulation. How susceptible do they become to the various burning regimes?
Russ?
Yes. You know, I used that picture of the beautiful Black Hills, and the various burning regimes kept those layers down, and the change in species composition that we've seen dramatically was much different when those fire regimes were natural or normal. So this is why I just brought it up as a subject, and Terrie hit it around big trees, but also that one picture of southern Idaho with those great enormous layers of duff and pine needles, that you get long residence times, you get some very deep burning, that again, these lower duffs in these modified forests can be very important to be a consideration in your burning.
Thank you, Russ. Mary, any other questions?
No, it looks like that was the only one, so we can wrap it up.
Why don't you do that, Mary? Thank you.
Yeah, Terrie just wanted to show this the slide of who helped funded and supported this webinar series, so you guys can view that. And in closing, I'd just like to say I'd like to thank Terrie, Mike, and Russ, and definitely our guest fire practitioners, Darren, Tobin, and Tyre, for participating in the webinar. And of course, thanks to you all, our audience, for your participation and taking the time to join us today.